Hello, and welcome to What If Deku Had the 10 Shadows Technique, the movie. So, let's get into the story. We're going to start the story with a young Deku just being at the quirk doctor's, being told that he unfortunately didn't have a quirk, and he was born quirkless. This would absolutely devastate Deku, as he only wanted to be a hero. But Deku had other plans in mind. He wasn't just gonna be completely hopeless about his own quirklessness. He decided that he needed to train his body so he could somewhat defend himself. If he told himself that he was gonna get into the hero school UA no matter what. So Deku from a young age would just train his body to the maximum. Nothing really superhuman, just unlocking the maximum of what his body could do. Just increasing his stamina, his strength, speed, reaction time. Those were all increased. By the time Deku was 5 years old, he had managed to unlock the 10 Shadows technique, as that is the innate time for a technique to manifest. And Deku's body was more than physically needed into the proper shape to hold a curse technique by that age. So Deku would, for the very first time, just realize something was different about himself that morning. Just having a different thing Deku would just feel different that day, but he still needed to go to school, so he would head off to school only to meet his class bully, Bakugo. Since last year, when Deku was diagnosed as quirkless, Bakugo has ruthlessly just bullied Deku for it, as Bakugo used to be Deku's friend until he was quirkless. So Deku just ignoring Bakugo for the meanwhile, just trying to live his own life in the class. The day would continue forward until Bakugo would just corner Deku at the school. Yeah, just at the school recess or whatever break. Now Deku would just know what Bakugo was going to be up to, just being really infuriated that he was at it again, just bullying him with his explosions. But this was different than all the other times. Shadows would manifest around Deku as two small wolf-like creatures would emerge from them. These would be the divine dogs. Bakugo, seeing this, would realize that Deku wasn't so worthless after all. He had finally awakened his quirk, or so he thought. But this was no quirk. Deku, seeing that he just manifested these Shikigami, he would just be utterly surprised, just so excited for the fact these Shinigamis were under Deku's complete control. Deku just finding these divine dogs just so adorable and so reliable. Yeah. So Deku just being called out of school early after the teacher would explain over the phone what happened to Deku. They would once again go to the quirk doctor, his and his mom, but the quirk doctors wouldn't see anything related to a quirk inside of Deku's body. They'd be surprised, just chalking it up to a weird quirk that wouldn't show up on the scanner, and just saying that Deku was a late bloomer. Now, Deku would be more determined than ever. Now he had his own power. He would just try to realize the most of his technique, only managing to figure out that he could defeat Shinigami and claim them into his own technique after just doing some experiments with his own technique. He would eventually summon a rabbit escape in his own room, But this would only be one measly rabbit at first, with a strange shield on its stomach. Soon more rabbits would come from that single rabbit. Deku would be overwhelmed. He would call upon his divine dogs. They would easily just munch through the rabbits. Eventually, they would kill the one with the mark on it. Deku just claimed his second Shimigami. These would be the rabbit escape. Not really powerful critters, but they would help, as their as their name implied. They were great for escape and just overwhelm an opponent with lots of targets. So the next 10 years would pass, and Deku would just continuously just try to obtain more Shikigami. By the time he was in the middle school, he managed to tame 3 more Shikigami. This being a bird like Shimigami Niue, which had the power of electricity, Orochi, which was a giant serpent that could immobilize a target very quickly, and last but not least, he would manage to tame the toads. This, yeah, they weren't very powerful, but they were managed to just restrict enemies. And so Deku would now be approaching the last day of his middle school. He would just continue with the day, with Baku just continually bullying him, finding his technique just to be quite amusing, as only summoning other creatures to do your bidding was kinda against Baku's own style, just pointing that out and just making fun of him for it. But not believe, yeah. But the day would end, and Deku would be on his way back to his house, where he would be stopped by a villain made out of sludge. He would soon immobilize Deku's body. Now, Deku, just completely immobilized, would think fast, managing to summon Niue. This would electrify the sludge villain, and just breaking down the entire sludge, the sludge around Deku, letting him get a quick moment to just breathe and escape from his grasp. Deku would just flee the area, as he was too early, as All Might would shortly arrive, just seeing the sludge villain in tattered pieces with nobody around. He would just chalk it up to some bird, some stray hero, and he would shortly just collect up the sludge villain, and he would be on his way to put the sludge villain in prison. And now the 10-month training would continue as in normal. Deku would just try to tame more Shikigami. Eventually, he would go forward and try to tame Max Elephant, a very powerful Shimigami that could control water to various degrees and was massive. So Deku, summoning this Shikigami, he would quickly immobilize it with his toes, just restricting all movement pattern for the elephants. Yeah, for Max Elephant. He would shortly just summon the divine dogs, which would easily manage to scratch away at Max Elephant's flesh. Max Elephant would blow away, more like just water away these creatures, yeah. Hose away these creatures. And that was Deku was looking for, just summoning Niue in there, electrifying the water, and it would lead back to the elephant. And with the elephant down, and yet another Shikigami would be added to Deku's arsenal. Over the remaining courses of the other months, he would try to tame 1 more Shikigami, this being Piercing Ox. Now this would be a bit easier, as Deku would have the advantage with Max Elephant, just preventing Piercing Ox from really charging up its attack and just flushing it away. And Deku would go after the next Shigami, being Piercing Ox. He would easily manage to defeat this with Max Elephant and New Way's help. Piercing Ox could have very powerful attacks, but he would have to have a very long time charging them up. So it was more of a situational Shigami. And that'd be the end of the 10 months. We would get into the entry exams. Deku would just easily manage to pass the intelligence part of it. Yeah, the practical exams. The robot section would shortly start. Deku would just slip into his own shadows, as this was something he picked up on his 10 months of training. Just maneuvering to the nearest robots. Deku would just summon his divine dogs, which would easily manage to defeat some of the lower pointer. Yeah, which would easily manage to defeat the one pointers. And he would just continue on with this. Eventually, just summoning the Max Elephant on top of a 3-pointer, absolutely crushing it. And not with Max Elephant in the battlefield, he would just water up them robots, just short-circuiting them. And Deku would just easily manage to defeat various amounts of the robots, just frying them with New Way. After Deku felt like he collected enough points, he would shortly see that a robot bigger than all the other ones had emerged, this being the 0-pointer. Deku, just not knowing what to do in this situation, he would decide it would be best to make his escape from the 0-pointer. But before he could do that, he would realize there was a girl's stat trapped underneath the 0-pointer's foot, or about to be. So Deku would rush in. With all his speed, Deku would decide that he would need to get his toads out, just grasping at the girl, pulling her out of the rubble, and managing to get her out of the 0-pointer's path. Deku, now with the trapped girl in his grasp, he would shortly just get her back on her feet, and they would make their escape from the 0-pointer. This would be noted by the instructors, and the girl, which would be Uraraka, would sooner thank Deku for the save. Deku would go back to his house, as he would be waiting for a couple of weeks to see what the results was for the UA entry exams. He was pretty confident in his abilities, so he hoped that he would manage to get into the hero school. Now, Deku in his free time would just try to figure out more about his innate technique. Eventually, reverse engineering Chris energy manipulation, just like reinforcing his attacks with Curse energy and other things. Eventually discovering that if he applied Curse energy in a very short frame before an impact, he could perform almost something as a double impact. This would be a divergent fist, but Deku, as he would continue progressing with Curse energy, he would eventually find out that that attack wasn't very efficient, since he didn't really have the freakishly human, superhuman stats to just make it count. But he would never really use Divergent Fist. He would just figure out this Curse energy. And he would just dive deeper into his 10 Shadows technique, eventually discovering that he had one ultimate Shikigami. This would be none other than Maharaga. Deku, just knowing what type of Shikigami this was, he would decide that he would need the rest of his other Shikigamis to even stand a chance against this one. He, just knowing that this Shikigami possessed the power of adaptation, yikes, that was a scary thing for Deku. But then the letter would arrive that day, and Deku would be accepted into UA High. Deku arriving on the very first day of UA. He would just find the place bigger than life. He would just eventually get to the hero portion, and there would take for the quirk exam. Deku would be the first runner-up for the first exam, which would be a ball throwing exam. Deku would step forward, holding a ball and being told that he would need to throw it as far as he possibly could. Now, Aizawa would try to use Deku's example, trying to erase his quirk so he wouldn't really have that much of an impressive mark, only to reveal later on that he erased it. But that would not work for Aizawa whatsoever, as Deku would just reinforce his fist and cursed energy and just completely throwing the ball very impressively for a normal human. As Aizawa, just taking note of this, would find it strange that he couldn't erase his quirk, and he didn't even summon anything. As the test would continue, Deku would just perform very mediocre on them, as he more relied on his Shikigami and didn't really have the physical capability, but he did manage to score better than the average human, since he was training up on his physical body. So with Deku just not getting a really surprising score, being like 6th place, since he was still better than the average human, but just relying on Shikigami more than anything, he would just be in that zone. And we would just move on to the next event, which would be the hero versus villains. And he would be paired up against Bakugo and Ida. And he would have a teammate of Uraraka. Now Deku, realizing this was the same person that he saved, would be a little this person-y. So with the test just starting, Deku would come up with a strategy, knowing that Bakugo was probably gonna target him first. He'd explain this, and he would just make Uraraka just try to get to the bomb as fast as possible. And as Deku expected, Bakugo was shortly out there just looking for Deku. Now Bakugo was very angered that somehow Deku's quirk just evolved on its own, just unlocking new capabilities and new powers. So Bakugo would just question this, and Deku would just have no reply to this, just saying that's how his quirk worked. And now Deku just summoned his toads for support, and Bakugo would just laugh, seeing Deku just thinking he could defeat him with toads. How humiliating. So Bakugo would blast towards him, coming in for a punch, but the toads would restrict his movement, as Deku would go down for a physical barrage, just beating up Bakugo with his bare fist. Now Bakugo just not taking this whatsoever. He would blast out of the toads, just exploding them completely, but they would still be clinging on to life, so Deku would manage to retreat them into his own shadows, preventing them from dying. Now Deku would just go hands for hands, just managing to keep up with Bakugo even though his explosions were active. Now Deku would need some support, so he would get his divine dogs out, just trying to distract Bakugo so he could come in with his own personal attacks, and just setting up the environment for his own for his own benefit. Now with Bakugo just having 3 targets, he would decide that he would need to take care of the Shikigami first. Going after this, Deku, knowing this, would already planned for this. So Piercing Ox would already be charging up in the background. Now Bakugo didn't really notice this. As Bakugo continued forward trying to deal with the divine dogs, it would only be too late, as he would turn around only to see a bull charging directly at him. Now, Piercing Ox has only been charging up for like around 5 minutes, so it wasn't as strong as it could be, but it still had some heavy damage on Bakugo, just completely sending him flying outside of the building. With Bakugo dealt with, Deku would go exit the building and just tie up Bakugo with this is a support tape, even though Bakugo was already knocked out. So, Bakugo was out anyway. So Deku would try to group up with Uraraka, seeing where she was at with Ida. Making it up to the floor with the bomb in it, Uraraka would already be there, just sneakily floating on the top of the ceiling, trying to just not be noticed by Ida. But Ida would notice Ida would notice Deku. Just seeing this, he would charge forward, asking him where his teammate was. Now Deku, just noticing that Uraraka was on the ceiling, he wouldn't say anything, just proceeding to summon Rapid Escape, as many rabbits would continuously charge at Ida. Ida, being confused by this, would just try to avoid them by outrunning them. Wow, he is a very powerful quirk, He can run fast. But Uraraka would be already over the bomb, just slowly releasing her gravity on herself, managing to land on the bomb, getting them the victory. And the other battles would carry forward with the side characters. And now we would go on to the USJ. We will begin with the bus ride. They'd be discussing who is the most powerful in their class. They would think it would probably be Deku, as he had so many versatility with all of his different Shikigami. But they would still make the argument that hands-on, Deku wasn't as capable as Bakugo or Todoroki, as they had very powerful quirks for close range combat. Even though Deku wasn't lacking in combat, but he was just didn't have a quirk for that. So they would just decide that Todoroki would have the edge over Bakugo, and Deku would be ranked 3rd. But Deku simply didn't mind this, that he would need some other plans for his close range combats. But that would be for a later plot, a later arc. So with the USJ just beginning, the hero 13, I think that's her name, will begin her lecture, just being like, your quirks are very dangerous, guys. Who knew superpowers could be dangerous in the wrong hands? But Deku would just have an odd sensation, as he would notice a weird swirling gap just appear in the sky. Now this would be a portal, and various different villains would arrive out of said portal. And as all just taking note of this, he would try to get backup, but the communications between them and the UA main building had already been cut, because they had been. The villains were just one step ahead of them for some reason. Now, with the students just being in trouble, Aizawa would try to just get them out of the building, but before that could even happen, the portal would open up around them, just completely scattering the students around the USJ. Deku would find himself in falling right above some water. Now, with this short time frame, he would quickly summon a new way, which would float him around over to a boat. Now, Deku, just being in the middle of this simulated lake, or it was a real lake, but Deku would just try to come up with the strategy of how was he gonna, escape his predicament. but he would be shortly joined by two other of his classmates, this being Suyu Asami, or just, yeah, Suyu, and none other than Mineta, the purple bald. Yeah. With the three of them, they would come up with a strategy on how to escape the villain-infested waters that they were surrounded by. First, Minato would just throw his sticky balls in the water, and Deku would just repeatedly shock the water with Nue. And with Nue just repeatedly shock the water, the villains would try to take an escape towards the surface and like out of the water, unknowingly just being stuck together with the balls. And now with all the villains just occupied, Deku would just make his way over to the mainland, where he would shortly see a weird bird-like creature approaching his teacher. This would be the Nomu, and the person who summoned it here, the person in charge of this creature, would be none other than Shigaraki, just hysterically laughing at this, as just seeing Aizawa previously just disarm an entire army of their villains, he would grow mad and summon the Nomu. Now, with the Nomu just approaching Aizawa, the Nomu would easily manage to overpower Aizawa, just tossing him around like he was a ragdoll. Even with Aizawa's quirk, Erasure, activated, the Nomu was still physically just absolutely dominating Aizawa. Deku would watch on as Aizawa's arm would be snapped like a twig. Seeing his teacher in such great danger, Deku would decide that it was now or never. He would get closer to the battlefield and begin the ritual, locking dead eyes onto the Nomu and muttering under his breath, eight-handled sword, Divine Sela General, Divine General, Maharaga. This would be the pinnacle of the Ten Shadows technique, or just strongest Shinigami. With Maharaga shortly being arrived, he would just toss Deku, completely just obliterating him all the way over, just sending him flying away. Now, Maharaga would lock eyes onto the Nomu, even though he didn't have eyes. The Nomu just seeing this, and Shigaraki noting that this creature, similar to the Nomu, was approaching it, he would find it amusing to see which one of the creatures would just obliterate each other. Now, Shigaraki would order the Nomu to fight off this Shikigami. The Nomu would charge over directly at Maharaga, just completely decimating portions of Maharaga's body. Just sending it completely just decimating Maharaga's body. But this was no trouble for Maharaga. He would just regenerate that, with his wheel beginning to turn in his head. Every single blow that Nomu would throw would do less and less damage. Maharaga would just continuously beat down on the Nomu. The Nomu would regenerate with every single beating, but the harder the Nomu fought, the more the Maharaga would be able to defend against it. Eventually, Maharaga would just realize that wherever he hit on the Nomu would just regenerate, he would go for the brain, completely obliterating the Nomu. Shigaraki, watching this from far away, he would grow terrified, as Maharaga would turn back, seeing Deku clinging on to life. He would decide that he would need to finish the job, just killing Deku. But Shigaraki would be infuriated by this point. Seeing the Nomu get destroyed by this creature, he couldn't let this happen. He would call over Kurogiri. Instantly, he'd be teleported right beside the Nomu. He would be teleported right beside Maharaga. Shigaraki would instantly lay all 5 of his fingers on Maharaga. Maharaga would turn his head, looking down upon Shigaraki. But it was too late for Maharaga, as he would get absolutely disintegrated, turned into dust. Now Shigaraki would be happy at this, seeing that Maharaga was just completely one-tapped by his decay quirk. He would grow relieved, just retreating off of there, just getting all his villains back to where they came from. Now, with that over, Deku would shortly be found by the other teachers and students, and he would be rushed over to emergency care, just recovering in the hospital for a couple days, as he would be told that what he did was incredibly risky, and he could have died with his whatever that was. Deku just accepting this, eventually getting back to full health. The next, he would just arrive back in time for the sports festival. As before the sports festival would begin, Deku would ask for some support items, as if he was going to be just being a close combat, he would need some type of weapon, some way to defend himself. So he would just get like a blade or something, like something of a tool, like a sword, actually like a mini knife, yeah, a pocket knife. No, not a pocket knife, just it's a regular knife that Deku could have just used. And Deku would store this knife in his shadows. Now he'd be ready, as his very trusty knife would very help him. He would just shank his opponents. Now the race section would begin, as Todoroki would instantly freeze over everybody. Deku, having a feeling that this would happen, he would jump right in time, just summoning Nue, he would grasp onto Nue's feet, just letting him glide on the ice, as Todoroki would be surprised at what he was looking at. But Deku would just get past the ice, eventually just riding Nue past the robots, and he would just return Nue back into the shadows, as he would find over the bridge, just weaseling his way across in like normal, since the little rope. Now Deku would get over to the... Now Deku would be faced off against the minefield. Deku, thinking of this, just taking note of Todoroki and Bakugo right behind him, he would simply just wait for the perfect opportunity, getting on Nue, and just finding and planting himself into Bakugo's shadow. There he would lay until the final make or break it for the finale of the race. Deku would emerge from Bakugo's shadow, stepping off of him and barely managing to grasp first place. Deku would win 10 million pointer headbands for the next round. Now the next portion of the exams, the next portion of the thing would begin, as Deku would get his teammate, just managing to just avoid everybody else for the most of it, just getting his Shikigami to do some defense, as he would never have to lay foot on the ground, just getting his Shikigami to attack the basis of the foot, just making everybody just stay away from Deku and just target other people for their points. And this strategy would easily manage to keep Deku's headband, and he would manage to move on to the 1v1s. Now, Deku against his first opponent would be none other than Shinzo. Now, Deku just stepping on the battlefield would find this to be quite a strange predicament for him, as Shinzo was only a general course student. Now, Deku would find this battle easily won, But as the round would start, Shinja would just start absolutely roasting Deku, just trying to get any reaction. Deku just not really falling for this, as he thought that was quite strange, and just connecting the dots that whatever was whatever his quirk was must have been related to Deku just taking the bait, so he would remain silent, just transporting himself over to Shinzo through his shadows, pulling out his knife and just shanking Shinzo. Now Shinzo would just be shocked that he just stabbed by Deku, but this knife would not be very lethal, as Deku it would be lethal, but Deku would not stab him in a very deadly place. So with Shinjo just being poked, he would try his best to get bait out of Deku, but nothing would really work, and he would be slobbered up by the toads. Just eventually, Shinjo would admit that he was lost, and he forfeited, as he could really do nothing against Deku. And he would get that stabbed wound just treated, as Deku would continue forward. His next opponent would be Ida, but unfortunately Ida would be just not attend, as he had bigger events. So Deku would just continue on with Todoroki. Now Todoroki would just fire off a massive ice blast. Deku just barely evading this. Deku would just summon off his Shikigami, just making them go over to Todoroki and trying to come up with a strategy on how he could defeat Todoroki. So, with the rabbit escape just completely swarming on Todoroki, Todoroki would freeze all of them. And that's where Deku would come in with Orochi, just sweeping up Todoroki into the air, where he would summon Nue, just absolutely electrifying Todoroki. And Todoroki just being in the air, he would just create ice thing, ice like frozen, you just get himself back to the ground and continue his long wave pressure attacks. Now Deku would just get his divine dogs out, and they would continue the assault on Todoroki, as Todoroki didn't really have much. But Deku would finally go through his shadows under the ice and manage to get over to Todoroki, just starting to put them hands on Todoroki. And Todoroki, feeling the pressure, he would instinctively activate his flames. Now Deku would grow excited, as he wanted to see Todoroki's full potential. But Todoroki would diminish his flames, as he did not want to use that as part of his quirk. So Deku would, after that assault on Todoroki, he would close the distance through his shadows, managing to get up close and personal with Todoroki, just starting to lay them hands, even trying to shank him with his knife. But Todoroki would instinctively activate his flames. As he would know to take notice of this, he would deactivate them, just not wanting to please his father with his quirk. But Deku would support Todoroki, just saying that even if he had daddy issues, that his quirk is still his to wield. Now this would inspire Todoroki enough where he would have to use the full capabilities of his quirk. Now with fire and ice attacks pressuring Deku would just repeatedly just maneuver around them, eventually getting Todoroki into a placement where he would have a free hit. He would charge up with curse energy imbued into his fist. He would go in for a hit, managing to actually hit a black flash on Todoroki. Todoroki would be sent back, as piercing arcs would break through the ice, managing to send Todoroki off of the stagement, as Deku, before closing the distance, would summon Piercing Ox to just lay down some strategy, as Deku would take the W, as he would question what just was, as he never performed a Black Flash before. He would just be in the state for a while, just trying to reactivate that moment. But his battle with Bakura would just continue, and it would start. And now Deku just having to face off Baku knowing the capabilities of Piercing Ox, due to the last time he faced off against it, he would be careful, as he would not let what happened to Todoroki happen to him, as he would instantly close the distance, as he figured that Deku wasn't very good with close combats. So Deku just not having enough time to form Shikigami, he would just go in for a hand-to-hand combat, just pulling out of his knife. He would just try to shank Bakugo, but Bakugo would just explode the knife, completely evaporating it from Deku's hand. Now Deku would be stuck in an awkward situation. He would just continually just throw enforced cursed energy enforced attacks onto Bakugo, managing to get enough space to summon a single Shikigami, and this would be one of the Divine Dogs. Now, the Divine Dog would pressure Bakugo from the other side, giving him an opening to once again try to recreate what he just did against Todoroki, managing to fail. Yeah, he did not hit a Black Flash for the second time. So, in this awkward situation, he would have yelled Black Flash. Now everybody would just the crowd would just go quiet, as that would be a huge aura lost for Deku. Bakugo just being confused, he would just easily get out of that predicament and reignite the assault on Deku. So Deku would manifest the other Divine Dog, and he would try out something he's been experimenting with. He would imbue both Divine Dogs into one more powerful Divine Dog. And, this is not made up. When freaking Megumi made the toad wings things, I'm gonna say he's gonna just combine the two Divine Dogs into, a lesser version of the Devil Dog or whatever. I probably butchered that, but this Divine Dog would be much powerful than the two of them, but not as good as the other one. But he would continue just keeping the pressure. Deku would just, after that moment where he failed to hit a Black Flash and lost all of his aura, he would just try to keep that out of his mind, as he would continually just put the hands on with Divine Dog, just doing the same thing from his opening spots. Now Deku would combine the Toads and Niue, just sending Bakugo up into the air, and he would be followed up by Orochi, which would come and bury him back into the ground. And with Max Elephant directly on top of that, it would quickly burn through Deku's curse energy reserves, as this would quickly exhaust Deku. But Bakugo would have severe damage after that wombo combo from the Shikigami. Now, Deku would just rely more on hand-to-hands, as Bakugo would have a broken... Bakugo would definitely have broken ribs by now. So with that, Deku would manage to just actually have an advantage with the hand-to-hand combat. Now that Bakugo had fewer options, Deku would just recover his curse energy, not very fast, but he would still have enough curse energy for one final Shikigami, and that would be Niue, as Deku would grasp onto Bakugo, just throwing him, manhandling him with the horse energy reinforcements, just completely tossing him over into New Way. Baku would be flung up into the air, just getting absolutely electrified. And this would be enough to make Baku just pass out from the immense damage that was inflicted onto him. Deku would stand proud. He would say, "Stand proud, you are strong." As that would be the last things that Baku would hear. And Baku would be infuriated as Deku would win the sports festival. And now the hero internships thing would play out. Bakugo just continued to be infuriated by his previous losses against Deku. But they would have names, and Deku would be the shadow hero. Potential man. Nah, I'm kidding. That would not be his hero name. But whatever name sounds cool. I don't know. I'm not that creative right now. But he would go into an internship. Surprisingly, I think he would continue doing his internship with Gran Torino, even though he didn't have one fall, because quirk mastery or technique mastery, since he needed to master the rest of his Shikigamis. And with Gran Torino's traineeship, he would indeed learn many things. And he would finally tame two more, the last two Shikigami before Maharaga, if I'm correct. Those being Round Deer, which is like a healing Shikigami, I'm pretty sure, and Tiger Funeral, which we don't know a lot about, but it's like a more powerful divine dog or something that had like even greater physical capabilities. So, with these two Shikigamis underway, Deku would just find a way to just implant them into his own fighting style. So yeah. Eventually, he would the Nomu attacks would continue out in that area, and Deku, just seeing this, he would have to get involved. Eventually, finding out that Ida had been in trouble. Just taking note that Ida was paralyzed in an alleyway with the hero killer. Like, oh, he needed to do something. So Deku would charge forward. Ida would just scream out, saying that it was none of his business what he did, and it was nothing that Deku should be involved with. But Deku just didn't want to watch Ida like just be murdered, so, and it was his classmate, so Deku would step in, and he would see Stain. Realizing the immense power Stain hold, he would begin the ritual, doing with the sacred treasure I summon Maharaga. I'm just kidding. Deku would not summon Maharaga, but he would just continue his charge forward, just finding out that if he got a single drop of blood ingested by the hero killer, he would be paralyzed. So now he would continue with his assault, just getting New Way to fry Stain, just keeping his distance as Shikigami user. Just getting Piercing Ox charging up in the background. Well, Funeral Tiger, Funeral Tiger would just continuously beat up on Stain. And Round Deer would just heal like Ida and the native hero or whatever. Now these top three Shikigami would take an immense amount of cursed energy, but it was alright. And eventually, Piercing Ox would release its charge, just absolutely, with the impressive 15 minutes charge up time. He would do immense damage onto Stain, just absolutely sending Stain flying back into the alleyway wall or whatever. Now Stain would barely be conscious, as with that much time under Piercing Ox charging, it was very deadly. Now Stain just fighting with everything he had just to get a drop of blood from Deku. Yeah, Deku would have been cooked if Endeavor didn't like just show up out of nowhere, since he did spawn in. Yeah, he just did spawn in, since plot, with Endeavor just spawning in and the rest of the heroes, they just capture Stain, and Stain would just be on the brink of death, being like, all of you are fake heroes, and let out his bloodlust, just shivering all down. Well, it did get paused again, the recording, but I'm gonna say that's what I already narrated was happened in this video, so hopefully that made it in. Now with the hero killers being defeated, he'll be arrested by the heroes, and that would conclude that arc, as they would be recalled back to UA for a break, as Ida would be severely injured. Well, actually, yeah, Round Eater did heal Ida, so would still be in trouble after he tried to do revenge against the man who immobilized his brother. But we'll be moving on to the next events, which would be the forest hero training. And this is where Deku would just go under training, as another bus ride would begin. And they would abruptly be stopped, saying that they had to be kicked out of the bus, and they had to fight their way through the forest over to the campsite. Now, this would be easily enough, as they would just arrive like in the same time. And back to the villains. We haven't covered what happens to the villains. All for One, just knowing about. I don't know if you all just heard that, but I'm assuming you did not hear that. So, with them just making it way through the forest, back to the villains, I said, and the villains, All for One would be like, damn, Maharaga, the power of adaptation, I kind of need that power. So he would plot out his plan, just hijacking Shigaraki's body, doing the surgery, and going after Deku's quirk. But it was a technique, so he couldn't do that. But now with All for One just completing the surgery on Shigaraki, would now be heading over towards the forest section, as he needed to get back on Deku. But Deku would be already be training, at the forest camp, training on the maximum of his technique, as he discovered he could have the potential. He had the potential to unlock a innate ability of his own quirk, manifesting a barrier around himself and his opponent. This inflicting a sure head disinflicting. In this domain, he could summon like an infinite supplies of his own Shikigami, have like 3 divine dogs, very plausible in this domain, and Deku would just be training up this domain. But the next day, which would be the day that Shigaraki would arrive, Shigaraki would lay foot as the forest would catch on fire. Shigaraki was ready to get his get back on Deku. Now, everybody would be alerted to this, as Aizawa and other heroes would try to get them to safety. And Shigaraki, he would just be scouring the entire place for Deku, as he needed to get his get back on Deku. Deku would arrive. Seeing that Shigaraki was going full force at him, Shigaraki would just blast Deku away, just completely obliterating him. Deku would just be barely surviving. He would summon Round Deer, which would just pump reverse curse energy into him, just fixing him right back to the previous day. Now Deku, the only way he thought he could defeat such a tank, such adorable thing as Shigaraki, he would need to bait him into his domain. So he would just summon the backup Shikigami, just distracting Shigaraki. Now Shigaraki, knowing that these Shikigami had not a single chance against him, so he would just easily manage to just kill them off, and the remaining of their power would just manage to split up among the other Shikigami. Deku, now just being completely in a situation, he would see that Shigaraki was coming forward, he would begin the ritual just summoning a Maharaga. And now, with Maharaga summoned, he needed to defeat Maharaga and tame him. Or he could just let Shigaraki do it, as whichever party in the ritual defeated it, it still counted towards Deku's benefit, since it does now, yeah. But now Shigaraki just seen that Maharaga was stepped in the battlefield once more. He already knew what Maharaga was capable. So in wasting no time, he would absolutely speed blitz Maharaga. Maharaga would just get on standback. Remembering that Shigaraki had a one-tap capabilities, he would just avoid all 5 fingers at all cost, completely avoiding that. And so Maharaga began to slowly adapt to Shigaraki's quirks, but Shigaraki would eventually land the decay on Maharaga. Now Maharaga defeated, he was finally added to Deku's arsenal as a free roaming Shikigami. Now Shigaraki would speed blitz Deku. Deku would just be utterly hopeless, and he would finally utter the words, "Domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden." Now Deku would be in his very incomplete domain, but he still had things. This was still very powerful for Deku's aid. He would begin now inside of his own domain. Deku would manifest 3 whole Maharagas, and at the same time embracing the power of the rest of his Shikigami, manifesting them through his own body, taking in the water power from Max Elephant, the strength from Funeral Tiger and the Divine Dogs, and now even with Nue's electrical power, Deku would be very powerful in close combats now. And with the 3 Maharagas just jumping Shigaraki inside this domain, Shigaraki would have a very hard time defending against all of them, as they would very slowly begin adapting to every single quirk possible. And now Deku would just have strength on par with not on par with Shigaraki, but he would manage to just keep up this distractment. And with all the Maharagas adapting this continuously, they eventually would just become immune to decay completely. With that one-shot ability just completely gone, Shigaraki would just continue throwing out random attacks that were manifested throughout different quirks. But this would have no effect on Maharagas. Yeah. And Deku would finally decide to embrace this. He would reinforce the Maharagas with all the other Shikigami's ability, creating another Maharaga, but this one would be Maharaga Totality. This Maharaga would be way more powerful, having the abilities of all the other Shikigamis. So the Maharaga Totality and the other 3 Maharagas would just continuously jump on or put them brakes on Shigaraki. Shigaraki would try desperately to attack the Totality, but Totality Maharaga was completely obliterating Shigaraki. It already had adapted to the decay and all the other quirks, and yeah, the other 3 would just support at that point. And Shigaraki with the Maharaga just overpowering Shigaraki completely now, like just growing massively in coercion with the And with totality just leading the pack, just obliterating it. Yeah, just obliterating Shigaraki with the lightning. Just drowning him and like, I don't know. Just overwhelming strength, yeah. Since, yeah, with all the other 10 shadows, just after a long fight inside the domain, Shigaraki would be just completely polarized. With all the quirks, just not even able to keep up with the beating that Maraga was just putting down. Well, totality, Maraga was just putting down Shigaraki. There's like an absolutely 0% chance. With Shigaraki just being completely just obliterated in a single tap. Yeah, Maraga just unleashed everything at once. And Shigaraki just turned into a fine mist as, yeah, Shigaraki was not regenerating from that. And All For One's main body, let's say, that died. Because, let's say that All For One was cocky and he thought that Shigaraki would never lose, right? So, yeah, All For One's already dealt with. And that would be the end of that. Yeah, Deku would just continue just being a hero, eventually making it to the number 3 hero, and staying there for a while, since I think Mirio would be a pretty a good hero, even though he wasn't really mentioned in this What If. But and yeah, Bako and Deku just alternate between 2 and 3. And yeah, that'd be the end of the What If. If you like this What If, yes. And I guess bye.